Hi, and welcome back to the Right on Crime podcast. I'm Ross Jackson. Today I'm joined by Dr. Derek Cohen, the Chief Research and Policy Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Today we're here to talk about debanking. Thank you, Derek, for joining us.
Happy to be here, Ross.
So we often talk about housing and employment as pillars of reentry, but rarely we talk about banking. Why do you think financial access has been left out of this conversation on public safety and reentry for so long?
Well, to be honest with you, and I can take it from, a practical perspective or the literature perspective, and I think the latter is probably more interesting when you think about it, because you don't know what you don't measure, right? You can't quantify that. And what we look at when we look at what is a approximate cause or risk of crime, it's usually things that are more approximate to the actual offense itself. So we look at, does this person have, negative cognitions or antisocial cognitions or antisocial peer groups, whatever the case might be. Because all those go, oh yeah, if you hang out with a bunch of criminals, you're probably going to offend, right? Yeah. So it makes perfect sense. The thing is, if you look at something that's has a more attenuated connection to, we'll just say pro-social life, that tends to be something that we don't get into some of the deep, second order effects literature. And to be honest with you, the correlation, at least the natural correlation that we saw presented, say, back when paper checks were all the rage. Now you're too young to know what a paper check is, but trust me, they existed. Basically said that, these people, if they had criminogenic tendencies in one area, they probably weren't, at the very least, weren't responsible with money, if not actually, doing nefarious things with it. And so basically when you had the check systems and everything that kind of arose as precautions to that, people are like, oh, yeah, makes perfect sense. We're just at a point now where the technology is such that a lot of those downsides that the institutions would face and would rightly want to hedge against are simply not really part of the conversation anymore. And that's kind of why we see online banking, essentially is this big behemoth that it is today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so why do we think that access to basic banking services is such a critical part of successful reentry and workforce stability today?
Well, I mean, you have to look at specifically the population that it seeks to serve with, we'll just say, second chance banking. This is broad and it describes, multiple, I think, kind of product offerings in that space. Mm-hmm. But if you look at it, you have to look at the specific needs that population would have. But needs that they might have that people that, that have lived law-abiding lives do not have. One of which being, do they have some sort of court-ordered compliance they have to maintain, whether that's restitution, whether it's child support, whether it's any sort of monetary damages. These are things that are going to get compelled by the court. Now, that court's going to have to go get it from somewhere. And if this person, again, if it was back in the, the Wild West we were talking about with paper checks, and you're walking with cash after a payday to the justice of the peace or to, to a bank to get a cashier's check or whatever the case might be, not only is that massively inefficient, not only does it take a lot of time out, which as we know that there is a premium on time, especially when there are probation and parole and other compliance mandates that we have from the criminal justice system. Not only do we have that, but now we're taking out this whole time to just comply with the court-ordered segment of that. This actually allows for not only that time to be spent in front of a computer, it provides safe and predictable and plannable ways of doing so. You could, we almost take for granted online banking nowadays.
Yeah,
it's so ubiquitous. Everybody uses it. There's 1,000,001 different products in that marketplace, ones that tie investment to it. We can talk about that later. But all that to say is we take it for granted. Now we can set up online bill pay, let's say with these entities or with an individual, if you have some sort of structured payment, say a child support or whatever the case might be. We basically can fire and forget that. Now, obviously, these work very functional to like a debit card would. Mm-hmm. If the money's not there when the call goes through for that to come, there's going to be the bells and whistles are going to go off and let you know that you don't have sufficient funds in your account. But the fact that you can actually stably plan for that if it's raining, you don't have to go across town and everything like that. You can actually just have that work automatically. And it's just a very, very easy feature that, takes a lot of effort off the individual who's, struggling to get there, or let's say affirmatively trying to get their life back on track as it is.
That makes complete sense. So we've touched a little bit on this before, but let's talk a little bit more about the technology and the improvements to those systems. So a lot of people don't realize that systems like check systems can effectively lock someone out of your mainstream banks for years. Can you explain how that works and why being debanked is such a major reentry issue in relation to that?
Absolutely. So again, I try to contrast everything with the bad old days, or the pre-technology days, I'd say. But that'd be one of the prime examples. Is so check systems, is basically a clearinghouse that has that holds an information that a bank will access during an onboarding screen that will say whether an individual is an appropriate risk for setting up to allowing them to set up an account with that bank. Now, we talk in criminology about risk. This is actuarial risk. This has nothing to do with criminogenic risk. But the actuarial risk that these individuals pose, let's say they had, because again, back when we had paper checks as the rule and not the exception, when we had overdraft fees and NSF hits, it was possible to get that bank account into the negative. And if you allowed that bank account stay in the negative, or God forbid, just walked away from the account while it was in the negative, that negative information would go onto the check to the clearinghouse, because, they don't want, or the other bank wouldn't want you to then go open another account, and the other banks wouldn't want to let you open an account when you have that injurious history on with the clearinghouse to begin with. So all that to say is you get some negative information there, and I believe there's a good, it depends on the issue, but at least a 5-year hold in which that is active information. Now, here's the thing. If you go to prison, even for a short prison sentence, and you come back and you don't have access to that, but that information exists, then you really can't open that account. So that, again, that was kind of a feature of when you were, it's hard to think about now, but essentially back in the day, your checks almost worked like a credit card. If you had a check and it was accepted by a merchant or anybody that you were giving the check to, it was assumed you were given on credit, if not established credit, but personal credit, that there was actually money in the account that would be able to be transferred from one bank to the other when that went and hit the to clear. And so we've functionally, since the digital economy has basically largely moved on from there. To be honest with you, I can't even remember the last time I've seen a paper check, and we can essentially work that now solely within a debit system, right? So when that says it's going to query your account the minute you try to pay, and if there's insufficient funds, the transaction doesn't go through. Some banks will probably give you a flag that you've just been hit with insufficient funds. But all that to say is that no money changes hands at that part, because it doesn't meet the pre-existing conditions. Nobody has to assume that the other person is acting in good faith. And so now, not only is that particular approach shown promise in, I would say, kind of modernizing individuals' finances, it's also really kind of been good for the banks as well. Back in, I think it was in 2011, the FDIC started piloting through 9 different banks, essentially these accounts that take a modified approach to that screening process. Because if a bank is not FDIC insured, then that's going to be that's a very big problem for the bank, because that insures the deposits within the bank. Yeah. And so what they did in the accounts is they said, okay, look, we'll still insure these accounts, but let's look at some of these alternative ways, because by this point, in the early 2010s, all this literature was coming out showing that there was basically a massive swath of the population that was, I would say, or underbanked at that point. Some of them had a criminal history, some of them did not. But the point is again, think of all that premium we talk about of having to exist in the cash only economy. I would argue you probably can't these days. But that was all off to the side. So when the FDIC goes, well, we need to take a look at this, because also I think the banks are wanting to get involved in offering these products to individuals of less than sterling information in the check systems. We need to have some sort of common framework for there. And so technology had finally gotten to a place where essentially the kind of the debit card was kind of the coin of the realm, no pun intended. But it was essentially, the going technology. And so having a robust infrastructure wherein somebody's, somebody attempting to make a purchase would actually query the account and check the balance of that and do that all instantaneously, solve so many of the other systems that the clearinghouse sought to address. And so, like I said, and now banks are actually, now fighting to get the bat rack to offer products like this, because you have an entire, I would say, underserved or unserved population now that these are kind of becoming more routine. But you have a hungry population for this. It's, the margins are actually smaller for the banks because most of these exist in, you're paying $0 to $5 a month, usually waivable after a certain balance or activity. And, you're basically seeing this almost be the preferred model to the old model. And that's only possible through the technology that has developed since the paper check.
Yeah. So I want to tie this back a little bit more to the work we do here at Right on Crime. We're all about second chances. Recently, we've updated our employer handbook to kind of address the issue of debanking and its effects on people reentering society. So the handbook highlights how financial instability can affect attendance, performance, retention. What are some real-world ways that employers see banking barriers impacting employees on the job?
Well, you mentioned it right there. And it's patently obvious. Like, look, if you're having, let's say, if you're in that cash only economy and you have to load up a bus card, just simple example, in order to be able to take public transportation in order to get to the job, well, that is an additional step you are now incurring if you are not in this kind of online banking ecosystem.
Right.
Now, a lot of people, and I have to hesitate because a lot of people just tie this direct one-to-one effect. They're like, oh, all we need to do to solve all these, problems with criminal offending is we just need to give everybody a job. And this is part that I know that's not what you're saying, but it seems to be a shorthand for people that haven't looked at it very much. And that's why you see folks like that. I forget what city it was, but the councilman who said all we need to do is, do all this spend money on all these other liberal hobby horses and crime will disappear. And that's, nothing can be further from the truth.
Right.
But that being said, a job contributes to that. I mean, going all the way back to, informal social control and routine activities theory, Sampson Law in 1993, like, look, a job is a component to the stability of life. It's not going to solve criminogenic tendencies. You can still be we'll just say a jerk, loaded up with criminogenic risks on a job with a job.
True.
I was going to say we've all been to the DMV. That is not a slight on our government workers. But what I mean though is that criminogenic risk exists separate from employment status, but you can't work on one if you don't have the stability that comes about with the other, if that makes sense. And so what we've seen is that anything that kind of disrupts that stability, whether it's intermittent employment or unstable employment, unstable housing is a big one. It's really hard to, think, for your quarterly review or think down the road to your quarterly review when you don't have a roof over your head, or you might not have a roof over your head in a day or two, right? It draws all the attention to the immediate when that stuff happens. And so in doing so, providing that stability there is one side. And to be honest with you, it really works out for the employers too. Right. The employers are, usually the first to implement that. Way back in the day, I used to work with a general contractor, and they had a payroll system. I mean, you had direct deposit and normal stuff as well, but they had a payroll system wherein you would essentially receive, if this were somebody that were underbanked, one of these style programs, you would receive the money on like I don't want to say a prepaid debit card because it wasn't prepaid; it was direct deposit paid debit card, but it functioned the same. And that is just by offering that program automatically erases half the problems I just enumerated, right? Right. And so not only is that one of them, it also because it makes a lot more sense and it's a lot easier, especially in the hourly trades and where you have timesheets and things like that. If you have direct deposit and you're not just cutting people a check at the on Fridays, that is so much easier on the employer's bookkeeping side than it is to do it the old-fashioned way. And that's why I think that people, or both the banks and the consumers and the businesses that make it possible with this, really we're not seeing a whole lot of resistance like, oh, I don't want to do, because with modernization makes you more attractive to more customers. And being more attractive to more customers, including this segment of the population, means more market share.
Right. You hit on a very important piece right there that I want to dig a little deeper on. So many employers assume that direct deposit is the only practical payroll solution. I know you mentioned the prepaid cards. Why is offering flexible payroll solutions like paper checks or payroll cards such an important second chance hiring practice?
Well, you want to meet people where they're at, and you want to give them the tools. You want to empower them to actually have the tools available to help themselves. See, this is where, again, I think a lot of folks, our friends on the left, get the narrative wrong. They think that we just have to do something affirmatively, like the state needs to compel something or do something. And honestly, when the state needs to do something, 9 times out of 10, I think the state just needs to get out of the way.
Exactly.
And so here we have a natural solution that, businesses are at. Now, look, I also have to say that this isn't going to work for all businesses. Something about the nature of their work, the nature of their revenue streams, their cash flow, it might require a closer to, it's not uncommon that some people get paid, especially in the trades, like maybe monthly, where it accrues over, a series of several jobs. I would say that's the exception, not the rule. We're talking, probably, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I'd guess probably nearly all the country, or most of it at least, is on the same 2 week cycle. Similarly, if we have a lower, I will say a band of employer or employee or work that has higher turnover, more hourly wages, more spot wages, things like that, some of them go weekly, right? And so, and then we have ones, to the point of your question, we have one specifically, we see this a lot in the gig economy. We have setups and I would say offerings from both the employer, or in this case, the business with whom they contract in terms of 1099s. We essentially have a thing where you can pull out whenever you want. They basically, we'll hold it, and then maybe once a week or a couple times a week, or once a day, that you basically can get that wired to your bank or to an account or whatever the setup of the provider might be. And you can actually withdraw that same day. I know that's really popular within the gig economy. Okay. So your Uber drivers and whatnot, I know that's a big offering that they have.
Yeah. So the handbook update that we just made, it encourages employers to partner with banks or credit unions offering second chance accounts. What are they, and how can they help employees build stability after incarceration?
Yeah, well, we can just walk this through on the practical side. So again, second chance accounts are essentially largely modeled after, like I said, that FDIC pilot that went through in 2011. It's, they vary in degrees, but they're basically ones that exist within an infrastructure that I don't want to use, tech speak, but like basically zero trust, a zero trust framework. So you're never and anywhere in this process are we taking it on good faith that somebody is acting above board. So that protects the banks, and it also protects the individuals. And so, in other words, I would open an account. I would set it up to be, there'd probably be a small opening to, but I would still not be subjected to the full check system screen that traditional accounts or accounts of I guess we could say, were subject to. And we see a lot of this with student checking, things like that, all these different products that just didn't exist back in the day. And so what essentially would function as, and what 99% of them function as, is simply a debit card. And so again, I go to try to purchase something, and it's going to query that account. Now, once that account exists, I can set up with my employer for direct deposit. It doesn't have to be, but it's a convenient feature to have to get that money in there so you can spend it as opposed to having to walk it across the city. I could also set up online bill pay. I could set up, if I have a court-ordered compliance item that I need to satisfy, I can set that and forget it. I can just have that in the actual computer and pulling out of my account every month. Set up for my utilities, set up for my rent, whatever the case might be, right?
Yeah.
Now, remember what I said earlier about the stability aspect of it. If your rent is being paid on time, or mortgage, if your rent or mortgage is being paid on time, if your utilities are being paid on time, not only is that showing, that you're basically creating the information necessary to be extended credit at that point.
Yeah.
So big purchases that do require a credit history, such as a house.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not saying that people that live in apartments are inherently more criminogenic. I think some people misread that. But the point is, whether it's an apartment, a house, a Quonset hut in the middle of the woods, whatever it is, as long as you have that housing stability, that is a functional aspect of that reentry plan.
Right.
And so, again, if you don't have that housing, the work just naturally is affected, even if it's just from short-term thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to happen. So having that box checked, being able to check in advance, being able to fire and forget does a whole lot of lift in there, even though ownership of a bank account has never been proven to be a criminogenic need, or the lack thereof to be a criminogenic need. It is consonant with all the other things that we demonstrate that are.
Right. I want to talk a little bit more about what we discussed earlier in regards to reducing unnecessary government barriers, barriers that private businesses may put up and not realize the effects of. So from an employer perspective, why is adapting payroll and onboarding practices often a relatively small change with a high return?
I mean, it's simply put, if you're setting someone up for success. Now, I want to put a pin in the idea of financial literacy coming out of prisons. That's a different question, but I think it's relevant here, but I'll
Absolutely.
put a pin in that for now. If you're setting somebody up, especially somebody who might have had that instability prior to, what we do know that before, back in the aughts, people were doing studies that showed, I think it came out of the Brookings Institution. I forget the author's name off the top of my head, but basically showed that the event of incarceration is a causal event in debanking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you say causal, it just means the arrow is pointing the same way and it's strong. It's not saying that your bank account closes because you've been in prison. Sometimes there was a related thing, sometimes there wasn't.
Right.
But even those that had bank accounts going in to prison, coming out, roughly half of them did. And half of them, so you weren't able to establish these general financial pathways that helped them. So on the employer side, to your question, if you check this, check that box, and you don't just like, hey, well, you're coming back, you're reentering society, Ross. I trust you to figure it out. You and your parole officer can figure it out. That's not a great, hope is not a strategy, you know, and I think that it's not illustrated anywhere more so than here. So one of the things you do, if I were an employer and I wanted my employees, and especially my formerly incarcerated employees, to make sure that they, showed up to work on time, did a good job, or focused on the task at hand, I would want to kind of clear out some of that brush, saying like, well, the guy can't get stable housing. How do I know he's focused on the job if he shows up at all? Right. And so what is a pretty de minimis investment on the employer side, and most people have these options, cookie cutter, ready to go through their benefits providers. They're ready to rock and roll right away without incurring any different burden upon the business. Mm-hmm. That it makes sense for them because, they're checking that box while also doing the stuff they generally have to do within the course of their general, payroll and your payroll and HR. And so, especially nowadays, I'd have to ask Zach. I have no idea what payroll or HR software we're using now. I'm sure it'll change in a week. Yeah. But that being said, is all of that being able to be managed in one place, which I know is one of the features that he's looking for, is something that, again, where we talk about the individual who's setting up the account can fire and forget, it's just as easy for the employer as well. And to have that routinized in there, they're basically scratching a niche they didn't know they had at that point.
Right. For employers listening who want to support second chance hiring but don't know where exactly to start, what are some simple onboarding steps they can take to help their employees navigate banking access and documentation requirements?
Certainly. Obviously, we've done a whole lot of work here at Red on Crime with making sure that individuals leaving Texas facilities are given I would say the appropriate style of ID. Mm-hmm. Which in and of itself, everyone thinks like, oh, you're just giving them an ID. It's not that's a big deal. That is. Because for all this other stuff that you need to do in polite society, you need to have an ID for. Yeah. And so at the very least, finding a job and getting a place to stay. Yeah. And so if I had to point them towards resources, I think I would read the between the lines and saying you want to do a shameless plug of the employee handbook.
Right.
So that's definitely somewhere I would definitely point them to.
Yes.
The work that Right on Crime has done on that has just been absolutely invaluable for the employers. But I'd also say just kind of look into seek your own understanding as well. So many of these individuals know someone that's been, I don't like the term justice involved because it really kind of takes agency away from the people who decide to get involved. But people that have had encounters with the criminal justice system at any level, there's a lot of those folks, and most people know one, right? And knowing that if we had a chance to make the reentry pathway, like take the degree down just a little bit, make it a little less steep, because obviously these people oftentimes do have criminogenic needs that need to be addressed, other stability issues that need to be addressed. But if this is something that we can address on the front end and do that, I'd say we go ahead and do it. And that's what I would also say to the employers is not only or if you have a categorical, mental mindset prohibition on this, you're probably missing out on some good, safe talent. I mean, obviously due diligence is warranted, but having a blanket prohibition as a mindset on second chance hiring, I think you're going to leave a lot of individuals on the table, especially with the way our economy has been run. Mm-hmm. The way our economy has been run, we've had record low unemployment during various times during the Trump administration. At that point, if you're trying to find talent, you will find almost any way to make your offering, your potential job more appealing to the applicants.
Right.
And in doing so, I think that this is just another one of those boxes to check.
Exactly. And the handbook frames banking access as not just an employee issue, but a bigger workforce issue. Why should business owners view banking stability as connected to retention, reliability, and long-term workforce success?
Well, I mean, look, in any capitalist economy, we don't have serfs. If you are unhappy at your job, you can go down the street and get a different job.
Right.
And, the only thing that we control, and I know this is going to sound like a Marxian quote, but it's not. But I mean, the value of our labor is the only thing that we have to control, and the better value that we can present, that's the way we do it on the employee side. Mm-hmm. On the employer side, the competition is just as fierce. Remember what I said earlier about the unemployment rate? If you have if your U6 has been at 4% for years, again, you will do anything you can to be fully staffed up. Now, I mean, that's great for employees, but you also have to make sure, the employers also have to make sure that they're making their opportunities attractive to employees as well. I think that this is one of those issues. Now, it'd be, how they say, if you're explaining you're winning? No, I don't think that's the way it goes. But it's really tough I said as a joke, it's really tough to explain kind of the second order effect reentry value that these kind of policies have, because they're like, oh, I didn't know that having a bank account kept people from committing crimes. Like that, you're kind of misreading what the signal is there. It's not that having a bank account does, is that having a bank account allows all these other things that do have that direct first order effect to allow them the stability, the routine, to keep them on the straight and narrow. And again, not a lot of people spend a lot of time in the life course criminology literature to see that. But it's important that employers understand that, because not that they should put themselves in an unsafe situation in order to provide an opportunity there. Through products like this, through practices that are discussed in the handbook and that we've discussed many times, it is now safer to do so than it has ever been before. And doing so, following these things, you're going to you might end up giving an opportunity to someone who you wouldn't have previously. And again, with the talent being at the premium that it is, that's probably a benefit to both parties.
Right. And to kind of, in closing, to tie this all together, what key message would you give to all of our stakeholders, whether that be employers, financial institutions, policymakers? What would you want them to remember?
Oh, especially in this realm, and when it comes to second chance hiring, second chance banking as a element to that, is someone, we get so many cliches, like, nobody's, somebody's criminal record's the worst day of their life and all that. And again, there's some truth, but it's a lot more nuanced. But the thing is, if you even look at the propensity for one to offend, that varies greatly over time.
Mm-hmm.
We all talk about aging out of crime, as a phenomenon, but we don't actually talk about the implications of it. Which, some people just go, oh, well, once somebody hits 45, they're probably not a scumbag anymore, so let's give them a job. It's obviously much more complicated than that. But what I would say is that there are ways, and there are now ways of demonstrating even, wherein people present a much lower risk than the perceived risk they would have to being hired prior to.
Mm-hmm.
We discussed this in the bail side. There's a whole bunch of things that somebody could have done, like skipping bail, that shows them to be a bad bail risk.
Right.
Similarly, there's people that have very pro-social ties to the community, family. They're not a flight risk. We need a system that not only countenances, but actually has individualized solutions for both ends of those spectrum. And so doing so, I think on the employer side, offering these products it's going to make you more attractive to a new talent pool. On the policymaker side, again, it's just, Texas, we've done a lot in this space,
mm-hmm.
and a lot of good work in this space. But I think there's also this knee-jerk reaction to trying to legislate for individuals, which are a dense constellation of individual factors, criminogenic tendencies, risks, needs, all the scientific buzzwords. We try to take what is essentially a very dense ball of twine and trying to straighten it out into one thing that fits through all. Right. And it's just, you can't do that. You need to have a much more nuanced policy view. Like I said, much like the other side, you need to have one that countenances both ends of the spectrum and every point in between.
Yeah. Well, that all makes sense, and thanks for joining us for this conversation. I've learned a whole lot that I did not know before, and I'm sure our audience appreciates that as well. Thank you, Derek, for joining us. And if you would like to learn more about what we do here at Right on Crime or use any of our employer resources, go to rightoncrime.com or follow us on social media. Thanks.